The snow had been falling since before first light, and Elias Cord hadn't looked up from his mending once. The barn needed no looking after. He'd made sure of that years ago, same as everything else on this land. Order kept grief from spreading. He heard nothing until the mare shifted. She was standing at the fence post, wrapped in a blanket that did little, dark hair carrying snow like she'd walked through it for miles. She didn't beg, didn't explain. Just looked at him the way a person looks when they've already run out of other options. "Go away," he said. "I don't take in strangers." She didn't move. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The lantern had been burning since before supper, though Elias Cord had eaten nothing worth calling a meal. A heel of bread, some cold coffee, and then back to the stable, because the stable had a purpose and the house behind him did not anymore, not in the way it once did. He worked the stiff bridle slowly, thumbs pressing into the cracked leather, feeling for weak points the way a man does when he needs his hands occupied. The stitching along the cheek piece had begun to separate. He'd noticed it weeks ago and left it. He noticed a great many things and left them. The fence post by the east pasture that leaned 2 degrees past plumb. The curtain rod in the kitchen that had slipped its bracket and hung at an angle his wife would have fixed before the day was out. He left it the way he left everything that didn't directly threaten an animal's safety or a structure's integrity. The rest could wait. The rest had been waiting 3 years. Outside, snow came down in the patient, indifferent way of high country winters, not in gusts or drama, just a steady accumulation, like the land was being slowly covered over and didn't mind. The valley beyond the stable doors had gone white and shapeless. The nearest town, Harlan's Crossing, was 6 miles east on a trail that would be treacherous by morning. Elias had made the trip 2 days ago for feed and a block of salt. The storekeeper, a round-faced man named Pratt, had asked how he was getting along out there alone. Elias told him fine. Pratt looked at him the way people in small towns look at men they've known a long time and are beginning to worry about, and said nothing further. Elias bought his salt and rode home before the light changed. He had a system. Feed at first light, fence check by 8, equipment maintenance through the afternoon, accounts and correspondence in the evenings on the rare occasions there was correspondence to manage. He had reduced his life to its load-bearing walls and lived inside them without complaint. His neighbor Cole Aldridge said once, not unkindly, that Elias ran his ranch the way a man runs a clock, keeping perfect time for no one in particular. Elias had not argued with this. The mare in the third stall shifted. Her ears came forward, both of them, the way a horse orients towards something it can't yet name. Elias looked up. She was standing in the gap of the stable doorway where the snow pressed in soft at the edges. A woman he had never seen before, wrapped in a wool blanket that had long since stopped being adequate for the temperature. She wore a traditional Apache dress beneath it, dark fabric worked with careful stitching at the hem and collar, the kind of garment made with intention, and her dark hair carried a dusting of snow as though she had been walking in it long enough for it to settle and stay. She was not young in the way of someone without history. She was composed in a way that cost her something to maintain. Her eyes, when they found his, were steady and gave nothing away. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Go away, I don't take in strangers." She didn't move. The wind came in around her, indifferent to the exchange, and the lantern flame leaned sideways and righted itself. "There's a town," he said, 6 miles east. "I know," she said, Her voice was even, accented but clear. "I came from the direction of it." He set the bridle down on the rail. "Then you know the boarding house. The woman who runs it wouldn't open the door." He had no immediate answer to that, because he knew it was probably true, and because the wind had picked up again outside, and the temperature was somewhere that made the question of a 6-mile walk purely academic. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the stable floor. Then he looked back at her. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "Side doors unlocked. You can sleep there until the trail opens." He picked the bridle back up. She didn't say thank you, which he found he didn't mind. She simply turned and walked toward the house, her steps careful on the iced ground, and the stable returned to its ordinary sounds. He found her the next morning standing at his kitchen stove with a fire already going, heating water in the pot he used for coffee. She had not touched anything else in the kitchen that he could see, which he noted without comment. She was still wearing her dress, but had set the blanket aside. In the daylight, she was more plainly present. The embroidery on her collar was red and geometric, worn to a softness at the edges from long use. Her hands moved around the stove with the competence of someone accustomed to making do with whatever a kitchen offered. "I didn't give you leave to use the stove," Elias said, not because he meant to turn her out into the cold, but because he wasn't certain what else to say. "The fire was out," she said. "It's warmer with one." He could not argue with this either. He poured himself coffee when it was ready and stood at the far end of the kitchen counter, and they occupied the same room in silence, like two people who have agreed, without discussion, on the boundaries of a temporary arrangement. Her name was Najoni. She offered it that first morning without being asked, simply because she apparently found namelessness inconvenient. He gave her his in return, and she used it with a directness he was not accustomed to from anyone, not with familiarity, just with the plain efficiency of someone who preferred to address a person rather than a situation. The storm held for 3 days. There was no question during those 3 days of the trail opening or of anyone going anywhere. Elias did his morning work and came in for midday and found the kitchen swept, the water basin filled, a rabbit from the yard skinned and simmering in the iron pot with some dried herbs from the bundle she produced from inside her blanket. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment and looked at this. "I didn't ask you to cook," he said. "I know," she said. "The rabbit needed using." He ate the stew. It was the best thing that had come out of that kitchen in 3 years, which he did not say. By the second day, he had established that she would not simply sit in the side room and wait. She was constitutionally unable to be a burden without doing something about it, which he found alternately sensible and irritating, depending on where he encountered the evidence. She repaired a cracked handle on his water basin using a method he didn't recognize, but which held when he tested it. She restacked the split wood by the back door in a formation that shed water better than the way he'd been stacking it for years. He looked at the new stack for a moment, then went back inside. On the third morning, he came in from the barn to find her at the kitchen table with a needle and a length of thread from her bundle, mending her own dress where a seam had given at the shoulder. Her work was very small and precise. She didn't look up when he came in. "The trail should open by afternoon," he said. "Yes," she said. He refilled his coffee. He stood at the window and looked at the valley, which was still white, but beginning to show the brown-gray of thawed earth along the fence lines. He thought about saying something further and found he had nothing further to say, which was its own kind of information. That afternoon, he rode to town and went to the boarding house and spoke to the woman who ran it, a tight-mouthed widow named Mrs. Fenn, and was told that she had a policy and that her policy did not accommodate Apache women regardless of circumstances or weather. He rode to the dry goods store after that and spoke to Mrs. Hatch, the school teacher who spent her afternoons there helping the owner catalog orders. Mrs. Hatch listened to the situation with her full attention. "She does needlework?" Mrs. Hatch asked. "Appears to." "Bring her in Thursday. I'll see what we can arrange." He rode home. He told Najoni there might be work in town for her sewing. She listened to this. Then she said, "I'll need to use the horse." He said, "I know." She rode to town Thursdays and alternating Tuesdays on a grey mare. He kept more out of habit than necessity. Using a saddle she managed without instruction. The arrangement with Mrs. Hatch turned into something real, small pieces sold through the dry goods counter, then a standing order from a woman in Harlan's Crossing who wanted a traditional pattern on a household cloth as a gift. Najoni never discussed these transactions at length. She came home with coins she kept in a folded piece of cloth and added to steadily, and Elias did not ask about them. He noticed things. He noticed that on the mornings she went to town the kitchen fire was still banked and the coffee ready before she left, and that on the evenings she returned the cold had settled back into the room in a particular way it did not have when she was present. He noticed that the curtain rod in the kitchen had been rehung level at some point in the second week, and that the eastern fence post he'd been meaning to address had been braced with a length of salvaged timber wedged at the base. Not a permanent fix, but a sensible one. One evening he came in from the last feed and found her at the table with a lamp turned low, not sewing but sitting quietly, looking at something on the table that turned out to be nothing, just a patch of wood grain she seemed to have found worth looking at. She was not distressed. She simply occupied her stillness the way certain people do without apology. He put his coat on the hook. He sat down at the other end of the table and poured from the water pitcher. "You have people," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Had, she said. He didn't ask further. She didn't explain further. They sat in that for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. She made him laugh once, genuinely, unexpectedly, in a way that startled them both. She had attempted to heat the cast iron griddle for cornbread and had used too much grease, and the result produced a smoke that drove them both out the back door into the cold, where they stood in the night air while the kitchen cleared, and she looked at the open door with an expression of such precise, dry exasperation that the sound came out of him before he could prevent it. He felt it happen, the unfamiliar movement in his chest, the sound in his throat, and it stopped as quickly as it started. But it had happened. She glanced at him sideways and said nothing, which was the correct response. He began to notice when she wasn't in the house, not with longing he could name, just as an absence in the room's quality, a return to a kind of silence that had ceased to feel ordinary now that he had something to compare it to. One afternoon in the fourth week, he rode into town for feed and passed Najoni in front of the dry goods store talking with Mrs. Hatch. He did not stop, but he saw her there, upright, purposeful, at ease in the conversation in a way she was not always at ease with him, and something about the sight of her in the town's ordinary afternoon light, belonging to it, settled in him somewhere without resolving. She came home that evening with a paper parcel, which she set on the kitchen table without ceremony. Inside was a block of good beeswax. "For your hands," she said. She was already moving toward the stove. He looked at the beeswax. His hands had been cracked at the knuckles for weeks, the skin splitting in the cold the way a working man's hands do. He had not mentioned it. He had not thought she'd noticed. He didn't say anything. But the next morning he used it, and the morning after that, and he was aware at some point that she had seen him do so and had also said nothing. And this mutual silence on the subject felt like the most complete exchange they'd had. By the 6th week, Najoni no longer used the side room off the kitchen the way a guest uses a borrowed space. She had not claimed it beyond what was functional: a folded blanket, her sewing bundle, the small cloth of coins on the shelf, but the room had taken on the quality of a place inhabited by someone who intended to remain useful rather than invisible. She rose before Elias each morning without effort, as though her body had simply synchronized itself to the rhythm of the ranch without being asked. Mrs. Hatch had expanded the arrangement at the dry goods counter into something closer to a weekly commission. A woman in the next valley over had seen the cloth piece and ordered a full table runner with Apache geometric work along the border. Then a second woman came asking about a decorative collar for a dress she was having made for her daughter's wedding. Najoni sat across from Mrs. Hatch on Tuesday mornings and negotiated these transactions with a quiet precision that Mrs. Hatch, who was not easily impressed, had mentioned to Elias in passing as remarkable. "She knows what her work is worth," Mrs. Hatch told him one afternoon when he came in for account paper, "which is more than I can say for most women in this county who sell things." Elias said nothing to this, but he thought about it on the ride home. Najoni had also begun helping the storekeeper's wife, a tired woman with 4 children under 8, who had been managing the store's back inventory alone since her husband broke 2 fingers on his left hand in a loading accident. Najoni spent an hour there on Tuesdays organizing the back shelves, not because she was asked, but because she walked past the open storage room one afternoon, saw the state of it, and apparently found the disorder more inconvenient than the prospect of doing something about it. The storekeeper's wife had tried to pay her, and Najoni had refused, and they had arrived at an arrangement where the storekeeper's wife sent her home with a jar of preserves and a measure of good flour, which Najoni considered a fair trade for an hour's work. Cole Aldridge saw her in town on one of those Tuesdays and came by the ranch the following week with the stated purpose of returning a borrowed post-hole digger he had, by his own admission, kept for 11 months. He set the digger against the fence and watched Najoni cross the yard toward the barn with a bucket of water, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had measured the distance often enough to carry it without spilling. "She stays then," Cole said. "It was not a question." "She's got an arrangement in town," Elias said. Cole looked at him. "That's not what I asked." Elias picked up the post-hole digger and carried it toward the shed. Cole followed. "She seems to have found her footing," Cole observed. "She found it herself," Elias said. "I didn't do anything." Cole smiled at this in a private way and did not pursue it, which was the thing about Cole that Elias had always valued. He knew when to let a thing sit. In town, Najoni had acquired the kind of standing that comes not from acceptance, but from demonstrated usefulness, which in a small frontier settlement often amounts to the same thing. Not everyone in Harlan's Crossing was comfortable with her presence, and she moved through that discomfort with a steadiness that did not seek to dissolve it, only to work around it. She knew which counters she was welcome at and which she was not. She did not waste energy on the latter. The school teacher and the storekeeper's wife were genuine, and she trusted genuine when she found it. She had also begun to carry herself differently, not with pride exactly, but with the settled ease of someone who has confirmed that she belongs to herself regardless of where she is standing. There was a distinction between who she had been the night she appeared in Elias' stable doorway, contained, certainly, but braced against the cold in more ways than one, and who she was now, moving through her days with a quiet confidence that required nothing from anyone's approval. Elias noticed the difference. He noticed it the way he noticed the thaw coming, not in a single event, but in an accumulation of small evidences. The ground a degree softer here, a mud line forming there, the air one morning carrying the first faint suggestion that winter intended to relent. He began doing small things he did not examine too closely. When he rode to town and Najoni was not with him, he returned with things she had not asked for and that he justified to himself as practical purchases. A better grade of thread than the kind she'd been using, because the dry goods store had received a new stock, and it was simply there. A tin of the particular dried herb she put in stews, because it was cheap and they had run out. He set these things on the kitchen counter without remark, and returned to whatever he had been doing, and she received them the same way without remark, which suited him. He began to linger at the kitchen table in the mornings rather than taking his coffee to the barn. He told himself this was because the temperature had shifted enough to make the barn less urgent at first light, which was partially true. But he also found himself, on the mornings she went to town, taking his coffee to the barn after all, which suggested the kitchen was not the operative factor. He listened to her move through the house, the specific weight of her step, the way she set a pot down with one decisive sound rather than a rattle, and he found the sounds unremarkable in the way that only familiar things are unremarkable. He caught this thought partway through one evening and did not continue it. He was aware that he was sleeping more soundly than he had in years. He attributed this to the season and the physical work of late winter ranch preparations, and did not attribute it to anything else. She had a way, occasionally, of saying something with such spare and accurate economy that he found himself thinking about it hours later. One evening, he had been trying to work through a purchasing decision about a second bull, whether the investment made sense given the current state of his grazing acreage, and he had been going around the same calculation for the better part of an hour when she said, without looking up from her sewing, "You already know what you'll decide. You're just sitting with it." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on her work. He decided about the bull the following morning and did not mention that she had been correct. The fence repair happened on a Thursday when Najoni had stayed home from town because of a brief sharp headache that had passed by mid-morning but left her cautious. She had come out to the fence line where Elias was working to bring him the water jug he'd left at the house, and she stayed to hold the end of a rail while he secured the post, because it was faster with two people, and she was present and capable of holding a piece of timber. The ice-crusted rail slipped. It happened quickly, the top board coming loose as the ground gave slightly under his boot, and Najoni stepped forward without hesitation and closed her hands over his forearms to counter the weight, and the rail stayed. They held it between them for a moment, her grip steadying the board against his, her breath visible in the cold air close beside his shoulder. He turned to assess the post and found her nearer than he had calculated. Her face was level with his jaw. Her hands were still on his forearms, though the board was now secure. He could see the embroidery at her collar in the peripheral clarity that comes when a person has become very still, and he was still, holding the rail, and aware of her warmth in the thin winter air with an acuteness that was involuntary and unmistakable. She stepped back first, or he did. He was not entirely certain afterward. He drove 4 nails into the repaired post with the focused speed of a man who needs something to do with his hands, and she carried the water jug back toward the house, and neither of them referred to the moment again. He thought about it that night. Then he thought about his wife. He had not looked at another person that way, not acknowledged it, not even let the thought complete itself, since the fever took her. The awareness of it happening now arrived not as warmth, but as a specific kind of wrongness, a guilt that had no logic attached to it, but that was as present in his chest as a stone. He lay in the dark of his room and listened to the house settle, and told himself he was tired and that tired men misconstrue things, and he mostly believed this, and the part of him that didn't was the part he pressed down under the weight of what needed doing tomorrow. He said less to Najoni in the days that followed, not coldly, not in a way that was designed to wound, but with the reduced availability of a man who has pulled himself back behind a boundary he'd let slip. He ate faster. He spent more time at the far end of the property on tasks that did not require assistance. She did not press him, which he knew was the correct response, and which somehow made it worse, because it meant she had noticed the change and absorbed it quietly the way she absorbed most things. Cole came by that Saturday. He had no stated reason this time, which was unusual for Cole, who generally kept up the pretense of practicality. They walked the fence line together in the cold, and Cole talked about nothing important for long enough that Elias knew he was working up to something. "She's good for this place," Cole said eventually. "Anyone with eyes can see it." Elias said nothing. "You know what you looked like when your wife died," Cole said, and the plainness of it stopped them both walking. "I mean the year after. I don't think you know what that was to watch from the outside." Elias looked at the fence line. "I'm not saying anything about replacing what you lost," Cole said. "I'm not that foolish. I'm saying you were a man who used to have something in his face when he talked, and for 3 years you had nothing, and lately you have something again and you look terrified of it." "Cole." "I know," Cole said. "Mind my own business." But he didn't ride home immediately. He stood at the fence with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the valley going gray in the late afternoon light, and Elias stood beside him, and after a while Cole said quietly, "She had a life taken from her too, whatever it was. You can see it in the way she holds herself." Elias did not answer this, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. The evening it broke open was ordinary. He had not planned for it, and could not have said later what made that particular evening different from the ones before it. Najoni had gone to her room. Elias sat at the kitchen table in the lamp's small circle of light, and at some point his eyes went to the far corner of the kitchen where his wife's sewing table stood, the walnut table with the hinged lid, the one her father had built for her, which had sat in that corner for 3 years closed and untouched, a piece of furniture he moved around without looking at, the way a man learns to navigate around a wound. He got up. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of it. He set his hands on the lid. He stood there for a long time. The lamp burned. Outside, the night was still. He heard Najoni's step in the hall. She had heard him get up, perhaps, or simply woken. And then she was in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair loose, her expression asking nothing, just present. She looked at him standing at the table with his hands on the lid, and she understood something about what she was seeing, because she didn't speak and she didn't retreat. He said his wife's name. He said it quietly, The way you say something you have not said aloud in years and have half believed would break something if you did. Just the name, Clara. And then he said, she made things. She was always making things, couldn't pass a table without her hands in motion. His voice was level until it wasn't. It broke at the end of the sentence, a small fracture barely audible, and he pressed both hands flat on the table lid and breathed through it. Najoni crossed the kitchen and sat down in the chair nearest him, not touching him, not reaching for him, just close. Present. She sat the way she had sat through storms and silences and cold mornings, with the quiet patience of someone who does not need a situation to be other than what it is. He stood at his wife's table and let the grief move through him for the first time in 3 years without pressing it back down. It was not a long time, and it was not loud. It was the kind of grief that comes out only when it finally finds a room where it will not disturb anyone, and this room, this kitchen, this woman sitting still beside him was that room. When it passed, he felt emptied in the way that is different from hollow. He sat down across from Najoni. The lamp was low. She would have found you practical, he said, after a while. She had no patience for people who couldn't take care of a thing. Najoni looked at him. That's a good word, she said. Practical. It is, he said. They sat until the fire needed tending. Then she tended it, and he watched her do it, and the kitchen was warmer after, and he did not leave the table until well past the hour he usually went to bed. The distance he put between them after that night was not the cold kind. It was quieter than that, a careful, almost imperceptible drawing back, the way a man moves away from a fire that has grown larger than he expected. He was still there. He still came in for coffee and sat at his end of the table and said the necessary things. But there was a deliberateness to his presence now that had not been there before the evening at Clara's table, as though he had installed a small interior border and was minding it closely. Najoni did not comment on this. She watched it the way she watched weather, with attention but without agitation, noting the pattern and waiting to see what it resolved into. She had lived long enough to know that a man who has just let grief out for the first time in years is not a man who moves forward without some backward motion first. She did not take the withdrawal personally, but she felt it, and she would have been dishonest with herself to pretend she didn't. She went to town on her usual days and came home and worked her evenings, and did not alter the small domestic courtesies she had built into the rhythm of the house. The coffee ready, the fire banked, the kitchen left in order before she slept. These were not gestures of submission. They were simply the things she did because she had decided the house deserved them, regardless of what was happening between her and the man who owned it. But she had begun to ask herself the question she had been deferring. What she was building here, whether what she was building was real or only the shape of something real, a life assembled from borrowed pieces in a borrowed room. She sat with this question on the Tuesday rides into town, watching the valley open up around the trail, feeling the mare move steadily under her, and she did not arrive at an answer so much as at a clearer understanding of what the answer depended on. Mrs. Hatch, who was perceptive in the way of women who have taught children long enough to read what people aren't saying, looked at her over the counter one morning and said, "You seem like a woman working something through." "I am," Najoni said. "Is it about the rancher?" Najoni considered this with the honesty the question deserved. "It's about whether to stay," she said, "which is about him, yes." Mrs. Hatch was quiet for a moment, sorting through an order of thread spools. "He's a good man," she said. He's been a diminished one for a long time. Those are different things." "I know they are," Najoni said. "The question is whether diminished is what he intends to stay." Najoni took her order and rode home, and she turned that sentence over for the rest of the day, and she was still turning it over that evening when Elias came in from the barn and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and said nothing for long enough that she looked up from her sewing. He was looking at his hands. His jaw was set in the way it's set when he was deciding something. "Mrs. Hatch has offered me a permanent place in her household," Najoni said. It was not an accusation. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, with the information in front of them where both of them could see it. She mentioned it last week. She would have a room and steady work, and it would be a proper arrangement. Elias said nothing. "I haven't answered her," Najoni said. He looked up. His eyes found hers and stayed there, and there was something in them that was not quite readable, not cold, not open, but something working at the border between the two. "I know," he said. She waited. He looked back at his hands. "I need some days," he said. She nodded once and returned to her sewing, and the lamp burned between them, and the kitchen held its breath. He gave himself the days he'd asked for, though they did him less good than he'd hoped, because the thing he needed to decide was not actually a question of information. He had all the information. What he needed to decide was whether he was going to let himself be the man who chose the living thing or the man who kept perfect order in an empty house. And that was not a decision that days of fence mending and equipment checks could resolve, because he had already been making that second choice for 3 years, and he knew exactly where it led. He rode out to the north pasture on the third morning and sat on the horse in the cold and looked at the valley. The thaw had progressed enough that the creak at the valley floor was audible again, running under the last of the ice at its edges. The mountains held their snow, but the land between was loosening, and there was a particular quality to the light that morning that belonged to the hinge point of seasons, not winter anymore, not yet spring, but in the act of becoming. He thought about Clara. He did this deliberately, which was different from the way he had been doing it for 3 years, which was mostly to not think about her directly and instead carry the grief as a general weather condition. He thought about her specifically, the way she had looked at him across a table, the economy of her humor, the particular morning she had told him she was expecting a child, the way her face had been in those last days of fever when she was still trying to reassure him. He thought about what she had been, who she was in the world when she was in it, and then he thought, for the first time clearly enough to bear examination, about what she would have thought of the 3 years since, of the curtain rod left hanging crooked for months, of the kitchen going cold every morning because there was no one who cared whether it was warm, of the version of him that had become adequate and nothing more. He stayed in the pasture for a long time. When he rode back to the ranch, Najoni was in the yard splitting kindling with a hand axe, working through a small stack of cedar with the same efficient economy she brought to everything. She did not look up when he rode in. He unsaddled the mare and brushed her down and went to the house and stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard for a moment. Then he went to the corner of the kitchen. He opened Clara's sewing table for the first time in 3 years. Inside, a carved needle case her father had made, a folded piece of unfinished embroidery, 2 spools of colored thread, a small folded note in her handwriting that said only the blue curtain cloth is in the cedar chest, a reminder to herself she never got to use. He touched the edge of the unfinished embroidery with 1 finger. The colors were faded, but the stitches were tight and clean, The pattern interrupted mid-row as though she had only set it down for a moment and would be back. He stood there until he heard Najoni come in with the kindling. He didn't close the table. She came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw the open table. She looked at it and then at him. "Her name was Clara," he said. "I've told you that." "You have," she said. "She was 28 when she died. She would have been 31 now." He picked up the needle case. She made things, not because she had to, because she liked making things that lasted. He set the needle case down. He turned and looked at Najoni directly, the way he had been almost but not quite doing for weeks. "I have been conducting myself," he said slowly, "as though living fully was a way of forgetting her, and I have been wrong about that. I understand that now." Najoni said nothing. She set the kindling in the box by the stove and stood in the kitchen with her arms at her sides, looking at him with those steady dark eyes that gave nothing away and held everything at once. "I don't want you to go to Mrs. Hatch's," he said. "I want you here. I want to say that plainly, because I've been not saying things plainly for 3 years, and I think it has cost me." She watched him. "There's more," she said. He exhaled slowly. "I'm afraid," he said, "of this, of what it means if I let it matter and then lose it. I've learned what losing feels like in the worst possible way, and I know it now the way a man knows a particular cold in his body, not just his mind, and the idea of that again." He stopped. "I don't have better words for it than afraid." Najoni crossed the kitchen to where he was standing, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the decisive, unhurried movement of someone who has made up her mind. She stopped in front of him. "I'm not asking you to forget her," she said. "I never was. I know that. I have also lost people," she said. "I know what it costs to care about something that can be taken. I'm not asking you to stop knowing that cost. I'm telling you I know it too, and I'm still here." He looked at her face. The lamp behind her made her hair very dark and her eyes very clear. He could see the small scar at the corner of her jaw she'd never explained, and the faint callus on her right forefinger from the needle, and the steadiness in her expression that was not the steadiness of someone who felt nothing, but of someone who had decided the risk was worth the honesty. "You changed something in me," he said. "I want you to know I see that. Not what you did, the coffee, the kindling, the sewing. What you are, the way you move through a day without requiring the world to apologize for being difficult." He paused. "You reminded me what it looks like to be alive without armor. I'd forgotten." Her eyes were bright, though she held herself still. "I was afraid too," she said. "Every week I rode to town I thought about whether to keep coming back." "Why did you?" She considered. "Because this felt like the truest place I'd been in a long time," she said. "Even when it was hard, even when you were far away inside yourself." He reached out slowly, with the care of a man who understands the weight of what he's reaching for, and put his hand against the side of her face. She turned her cheek slightly into his palm, and he felt her exhale, and the kitchen was very quiet around them. He kissed her with the full deliberateness of a man who has weighed a thing completely and then chosen it. Not with urgency, but with certainty, which is different and carries more. Her hand came to rest against his chest over his heart, and he kept his hand at her face, and they stood in the kitchen where Clara's table stood open, and the fire burned in the stove. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias Cord was entirely present in a moment rather than standing outside it. Spring came properly that year in the 3rd week of April, which the old-timers in Harlan's Crossing said was late but dependable. The creek ran full. The north pasture greened from the bottom up. Elias bought the second bull he'd been calculating and spent a week integrating him into the herd with the focused patience of a man who has enough good things in front of him to take the work seriously. He and Najoni did not immediately change the structure of the house. The side room remained hers for another few weeks, by mutual and unspoken agreement, in the way that people who have both been through hard things sometimes choose to let a good development settle into itself before asking anything more of it. They moved through the days with the ease of two people who have already done the difficult work of knowing each other, and the new layer of honesty between them made the ordinary things, the morning coffee, the evening meal, the conversations that developed easily out of the day's events, feel like what they actually were, which was a life being built in earnest. Cole Aldridge came for Sunday dinner in early May. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on the empty fourth chair and ate the best meal he'd eaten since his own wife was living, and told Najoni so directly, and she thanked him without false modesty, which he appreciated. After dinner, he and Elias stood at the fence line with the last of the light going gold over the valley, and Cole said nothing for a long time. "You look like yourself again," he said finally, "the version from before." Elias leaned his arms on the top rail. "Different than before," he said. "Better than before," Cole said, "but I didn't want to push it." Elias smiled at that, a real one, slow and full at the corners, and Cole looked at the valley because it seemed like the decent thing to do with that moment. The question of a formal arrangement came from Najoni, which did not surprise Elias. She raised it on a June evening when the kitchen windows were open and the air coming in from the pasture was warm for the first time in months. She said it with the same plainness she brought to every consequential thing, that she was not a woman who lived in the in-between indefinitely, that she had earned her own ground and she was not asking for anything she hadn't decided she deserved, that if his intention was a life together, she would like that said clearly. He told her it was. He asked Cole to ride to town with him the following week and procured a ring from the jeweler there, a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone, which the jeweler had made and which Elias had not initially planned to choose until he saw it. He brought it home and gave it to her at the kitchen table after dinner, with no particular ceremony beyond sitting across from her and setting it down and saying, "I'd like you to have this." She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him, then she put it on her right hand first by habit, considered, and moved it to the left. "Practical," she said. "It is," he said, and she laughed, really laughed, a full and unguarded sound that filled the kitchen, and he felt it move through him like light through a window that has been nailed shut for years and has finally been opened. They were married in August by a circuit preacher who came through Harlan's Crossing twice a year. Mrs. Hatch witnessed. Cole stood beside Elias with the expression of a man attending to something he considers his own partial accomplishment. The ceremony was short and unadorned, conducted in the yard of the ranch with the mountains at their backs and the late summer valley spread below. And it was exactly what both of them wanted. Nothing performed, nothing unnecessary, just the words said out loud in front of people who meant something. Najoni wore her best Apache dress, the one with the red geometric embroidery at the collar and hem that she had repaired with her own thread one cold winter morning at a kitchen table in a stranger's house. Elias wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and the expression of a man who has been given something back that he had accepted losing, and who understands fully what he has been given. The ranch changed the way living things change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in an accumulation of small visible evidence. Clara's sewing table moved from the kitchen corner to the sitting room, where Nijoni used it on winter evenings for the fine work that needed good light. She had asked Elias first, and he had said yes without the pause she had braced for, and the table sat in its new place with the unfinished embroidery folded neatly inside, still there, still hers, untouched, but belonging now to a room that was alive again. The curtain rod in the kitchen had been rehung level so long ago that neither of them could quite remember who had finally done it properly. New curtains had been sewn and hung and washed so many times they had already begun to fade pleasantly at the edges. The side room off the kitchen had been cleared of its tack in the spring and fitted with a small bed and a chest of painted wood and a lamp on a bracket, in anticipation of a specific future that arrived the following April on a night of cold rain when Elias sat in the kitchen and held onto the edge of the table for 2 hours until the sound from the back room shifted into the sound that meant everyone was alive and safe. A boy. Dark-haired, quiet in the way of someone who is taking stock of a new situation before rendering judgment, which Elias recognized immediately as an inherited trait, and which made him laugh in the way that things make you laugh when they are true. They named him Thomas, which had been Nijoni's grandfather's name in the English version he had chosen for himself, a man she described as the most practical person she had ever known. Elias thought this was fitting. Cole came to see the baby and held him with the careful solemnity of a large man handling something small and consequential, and reported that he had his mother's eyes and his father's general expression of being done with nonsense. Nijoni said this was accurate. Elias did not argue with it. That winter, when the snow came again in the patient, indifferent way of high country winters, the house was different than it had been. The same in structure, same walls, same beams, same kitchen with the same stove, but different in the way that a house is different when it contains people who are tending to each other. The fire was banked at night and built up in the morning. There were 2 cups on the kitchen table. Thomas slept in the small side room while the lamp burned low in the hall, and outside the valley filled with white, and inside the ranch the warmth held. Elias sat at the kitchen table one evening in December while Nijoni fed the baby and the lamp burned between them, and he thought about the morning 3 years ago when he had stood in his stable with a cracked bridle and believed without question that what was behind him was all there would ever be. He thought about the way she had stood in the snow at his fence line and not moved when he told her to go. He thought about what it would have cost both of them if she had listened to him. He looked across the table at her, her head bent over Thomas, one hand at the baby's back, the lamplight on the side of her face, and felt something that had no clean name, the particular compound of grief and gratitude and love and forward motion that a person feels when they understand clearly that they almost missed their own life. She looked up and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She held his gaze for a moment with those steady dark eyes that had looked at him through storms and silences and his worst possible self, and had not looked away. Then she returned her attention to the baby, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the snow came down steady and soft, and the ranch held everything worth holding inside its walls. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So till we meet again, Friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.